Adam, when fantastic fiction mostly brings up associations with Dungeons and Dragons, swords and sorcery, do Kafka's writings belong in this genre at all? And if so, in what ways?
Well, hello, Marina. It's fantastic to be here. It's true that I think there's a certain way of thinking about the fantastic that would in some way preclude the writing of someone like Kafka, because Kafka is now seen so central to the project of the European novel. And I think the interesting thing about the novel in Europe is that if you think that it began roughly, say, with Don Quixote by Cervantes, and the novel form set itself up as something which essentially derided the fantastic, where it was kind of predicated on a certain realism, where you have someone who's reading of romances, and also going back to your 1001 Nights with Anadela, where even there is a fiction that this is in fact a manuscript that has been translated from the Arabic. And so the European novel somehow constructs itself as the real against previous literature, which was seen as kind of fantastical and therefore in some way beneath notice. And that theme runs through the whole of the novel, where you think that something like Madame Bovary is just another version of Don Quixote in another form, that she again is mocked for her reading of romances. And I think what, though, makes Kafka so important is because he brings the fantastic into the novel, into the European novel, because he at once comes from writers like Dickens and Flaubert, so he comes entirely from what we would think of as a realist tradition, but then uses it to explore situations that writers like that would have simply thought were not capable of being treated in literature. And then you could, I think, put that the other way and say he also brings the novel, as it were, to the fantastic as well. That there's a sort of this wonderful, weird melting that he does that I think makes him so important, because without that influence, I think the kind of history of the 20th century novel after him is unthinkable.
One of the reasons I think I wanted to explore the fantastic in this series was because it is often derided, and I feel kind of wrongly that this does an injustice to readers who have so much pleasure in it, and also to the long history of human imagination and invention, which has focused on this so much, especially amongst unlettered societies. And Kafka interests me because while he's, as you say, quite rightly, involved in the whole major works of realist fiction like Dickens, he loved Dickens, and Flaubert, he also drew tremendously on what are called simple forms. I mean, he drew on proverbs and wisdom literature, animal fables, and we'll get to that later. But perhaps we should look a little bit, because his many of his writings are autobiographical. So maybe we should look a little bit at his background and his life first.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a wonderful 3-volume biography was published in Germany. It's now in English by a German writer called Rainer Stark. And I think that's really helped not just establish the facts of his life, which I think were relatively well established, but to partly disentangle a certain amount of myth that has obviously also accrued to Kafka's life. Because I think while being one of the most famous writers of the 20th century, he's also in one sense deeply unknown. So he was born in 1883. So he was born into an assimilated Jewish family in Prague, in the German-speaking community. So there was this, I think, becomes very important to him in a way, sort of double dislocation, that he's a minority within a minority.
Also, his father had done well.
His father was
had
prosperous.
Been brought up in tremendous abject poverty, but had now a kind of real shop in a very good part of Prague.
Yeah, so they were prosperous, and they lived. He lived there with his sisters, and he then gets a good job, as it were. So when he's 25, he joins the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is a job that I've always loved. And he basically works there all his life. So he works, processing insurance claims. And
there's a real connection, isn't there, with his writing?
Absolutely.
I think the meticulous scrupulousness. He's a clerk, and he shows that in his work.
And I think also the idea, which I think we'll come to, of the need in the modern era to have written proof, as it were, that you're making a claim, but that the claim will only be met if you have certain documents, or if the documents are written in the correct form, it's extraordinary, I think, how quickly Kafka could see into that bureaucratic universe, as it were. And,
he was also trained as a lawyer for a while, wasn't he? He studied law.
Yeah, I think he studied law.
And there's a legalistic aspect as well to his very careful chronicling of every motion and every sort of event, vicissitude.
Yeah, and I think exactly, because I think that when you look at the German, the way he writes is always these very precise clauses and sub-clauses nested inside each other. There is a definite resemblance to the way a legal document will entertain every possible hypothetical.
He also didn't merely process claims when there had been accidents. He worked on accident prevention. And I think that's also quite interesting in terms of what his writing does, what his fables imagine.
Yeah, it's true. And I think because they are often concerned with risk, actually, and trying to avoid risk, or how do you make the precautions such that disaster will not happen. And so they very much are the stories, in a sense, of an insurance broker.
I thought there was a kind of sub-history one could do, because Wallace Stevens was also an insurance...
It's true, he was... But I think, unlike his Stevens, I think, always slightly disliked his job, as it were, that he felt that if only he could sort of just be a poet. And I think Kafka, there's a deeper comedy to the way, that you read in his diaries, he's always complaining that he doesn't have enough time to write. And he clearly did basically only write at night, when the family was asleep and when he had time away from the office. And yet, at the same time, that was clearly the condition he needed to write. And so I think there's something... He clearly did not ever think that he was going to leave his job, even if it was tormenting him. And so there's something very kind of, I don't know, both desperately sad and very comical at the same time, which is a very common theme I think we'll come to with Kafka. He met Max Brod when he was actually quite young, when he was 19, and that became, in a sense, the most important relationship in his life. So they were best friends. And again, in some senses, were a kind of comical duo where Brod was much more successful than he was as a writer, was incredibly branché and mondain, would sort of know everybody. And it's also become quite now common, I think, to make fun of Brod as well, because there is such a mismatch between the way he experienced the world, which was as most people experienced it, and then his friend Kafka, who seemed to live in this extraordinary different way. But the one thing that was, clearly true is that Brod always thought he was a genius. That he always immediately recognized that Kafka was something extraordinary, as he actually did elsewhere. That he was also one of the main champions of Janacek as well. And so there's something very, I think, wonderful about Brod, that this person who in some senses clearly didn't get either of these two people that he championed still was the person who made them available and fought for them. So I will always love Brod for that.
Have you read him?
I've only read actually his books about Kafka, and there is one, and I think we'll come to that later, but there's definitely a way in which Brod is to blame for a certain view of Kafka, which I think is slightly, very sentimental and tendentious.
As a martyr to tuberculosis.
As a martyr to
incomprehension.
And as a mystic, essentially.
Yes.
Which I think is probably not true.
But he did this marvellous thing, which is he disobeyed
his wishes. Yeah.
His last wishes were to be that all his manuscripts should be destroyed, and also his books should not be reprinted after their initial run ran out. And he disobeyed that. Yeah. And that's why we have all this amazing work.
Exactly. So it's always interesting, I think, with Kafka, there is this ethical problem of why the work even is available at all, which you have to slightly grapple with in some sense while talking about it, and it's sort of strange given that these questions of the law and of guilt are so important to Kafka, and there is a question of guilt or shame about whether we're even allowed to be reading some of the kind of work. And I think it's...
I think psychologically it's very delicate, because people could destroy their own manuscripts.
It's true. I think at the same time, when you look at Kafka, there are ways where I think that I'm not sure you can kind of exculpate Brod, because by the time Kafka was actually dying, he was away from his manuscripts. He was in sanatoria. And so it's true that he never destroyed them when he could. But then at the same time, I think that's a delicate problem, because I think as a writer, you must know this too, that no notebook is dead to you, as it were. So, and clearly he was working constantly on things. And so I can see that while he was alive, he might have thought he would always go back to finish certain texts. So I think that it's impossible, I think, now to know how seriously, Broad always said that he categorically told Kafka that he would not carry out his wishes. So if he should get a different executor. The problem with that, I think, is that was in a conversation where Broad had also asked Kafka to destroy some of his own writings, because Kafka was going to be Broad's executor. And so it's strange where Broad clearly had some sense of privacy in his own writing, and then went ahead and didn't just publish, which I think would be definitely kind of justifiable, the novels, as it were, but did also publish diaries, letters, everything he could find. And it's not obvious, I think, at all that Kafka would have in any way assumed that those would see the light of day. And I think that's something we should talk about, because it does condition some ways of reading him. And so the other, I think, important thing is that he never married. He was constantly engaged. He was, in some senses, like Bertie Wooster or something, that he was always getting engaged. And then, like Kierkegaard, I guess, as well, then trying to back out, or, and so he... And also was actually quite engaged in the world of publication. That I think there is one part of the myth is that nothing was published, and that he had...
He was ignored.
And that this is actually very much untrue, that he was, from very early on in his career, approached by excellent publishers, was courted by them, was published initially by Rowohlt and then Kurt Wolf, and did publish... What he obviously liked doing was publishing very slim books. So he would publish...
With a lot of air around the page.
With a lot of air around the page, yeah. And with very large type. There's a very lovely letter where he writes to one of his publishers saying he needs the type to be larger, which makes a lot of sense, I think, because he writes with very little, don't know what the word would be, like articulation. So there are very few colons, semicolons, and paragraph breaks. He likes long paragraphs just with commas.
Do you think that's an effect of him writing in a language which was one of many that he knew? It may have been his dominant language, but he had Yiddish... and knew many other. He
knew some Hebrew. I don't know. I think German was definitely his major language.
He spoke and wrote fluently in Czech, though.
I don't know. I think it's part of his style. It's also clearly there was an idea of him. I think we mentioned that he wrote at night. He saw some beauty in writing in a kind of headlong fashion, and I think possibly psychologically one reason for that was that he clearly was so artistically neurotic, as it were, that once he was out of the inspirational sort of moment, I think that he would then get so absorbed in minute corrections that he would then find it impossible to finish. So often for him, the way he had of finishing a work was to try and write it as fast as possible. And I do wonder if there's some connection there, this kind of idea of, for him, that perfect story had some kind of flow. And so he didn't want to divide it in the same way that I think kind of more classical writers might have divided it up.
Prague at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there was also Vienna, a kind of shadow of Vienna, and Viennese German as well.
Yeah, so there were all these different Germans, as it were. And I think Prague was probably seen as slightly provincial. Vienna or even Berlin would have been seen as the centres of German kind of writing. And one of the dilemmas in his life, as well as whether to marry anybody, was whether he should essentially become a writer and move to Berlin. There's a very interesting moment in his career, I think, where Robert Musil, who was already relatively well known, he hadn't yet published The Man Without Qualities, which was the novel that would kind of make him also one of the great modernist writers. But he was the editor of the Neue Rundschau, which is a very influential magazine. And he had picked up on Kafka from the beginning. And he writes Kafka a letter basically saying, this is when he's just read the manuscript of what we now call Metamorphosis, of the story where Gregor Samsa wakes up to discover himself transformed. And Musil basically offers to dedicate an entire issue of the Neue Rundschau to this story. And not just that, but that says, look, you should move to Berlin. I know everyone here. I will put you in touch with everybody. So essentially, it's offering to be the even more branché version of Max Brod. And Kafka does think about this for a very long time. And the problem with this is that the offer was made in February 1914, and then the war breaks out, and then this whole project disappears. And then by 1917, Kafka is diagnosed with tuberculosis when he's still very young. The other thing that I find incredibly poignant about this is that he was dead by 40. So there is also this incredible tragedy that the extraordinary work that survives is technically early work.
In fact, his tuberculosis made him break off I think Felice Bauer broke off the engagement because it was a death sentence. I mean, it was not...
Yeah.
So he felt himself to be excluded from the possibility of a long, happy life.
Exactly. I think that he thought that, and this was clearly something, though, that it was almost as if he was born to get tuberculosis, that this terror of getting ill was there in Kafka from the beginning.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.